Reopening, do you think it's all too fast or do you think it's all too slow? We'll talk to leaders across the country about the pathway out of these lockdowns.
Q&A, Monday on ABC and iView.
Good evening, it's Friday the 8th of May. Here are our top stories. The roadmap out. The National Cabinet approves a three-step plan to ease coronavirus restrictions. And Europe marks the 75th anniversary of VE Day, with much of the continent under virus lockdown. Pro-China and Democratic politicians scuffle inside Hong Kong's legislature. And an Indonesian couple's solution to stop masks getting in the way of deaf people lip reading. You're watching The World. A little later, India's biggest repatriation since the Gulf War underway as thousands of stranded citizens are flown home. Prime Minister Scott Morrison says he hopes Australia will be mostly reopened by July and has unveiled the three-step plan agreed to by National Cabinet to get there. Well, step one of easing restrictions will see restaurants, playgrounds and community centres reopen with groups of up to 10 people allowed at most public events. Now, step two will add gyms, cinemas, galleries and beauty therapists to the list of businesses allowed to reopen, while upping the numbers for gatherings to 20. Step three further increases the size of gatherings to up to 100, allowing for food courts, nightclubs and most workplaces to resume. It also includes the resumption of interstate travel and exploring the possibility of travel to New Zealand and Pacific Islands, as well as for international students. It'll be up to the states and territories to implement the steps as they see fit. But if all goes to plan, work, family, social life and leisure could almost be back to normal within 3 months. From Parliament House, here's National Affairs correspondent Greg Jennett.
A small wedding party for 10 in May, a camping adventure in June, maybe even a movie for up to 100 in July. 3 milestones in 3 crucial months, mapping this country's coronavirus comeback.
This is the plan for a COVID-safe Australia.
It covers 10 slices of life, from shopping to home gatherings, sport, dining and even massage. Step 1 generally limits gatherings in public places to about 10 people and 5 visitors at home. 3 weeks later, Step 2 lifts the numbers in most settings to 20. Then in July, Step 3, allowing gatherings of 100 people and perhaps the return of interstate travel.
You can't just go from zero to go in like that, so they have to have that slow process, I guess.
Yeah, it's great news. Exercise has been important. People are exercising more now, and I think they'd love to do it together.
We've got to start getting things back to normal if we can.
Early signs suggest people are ready.
You will be seeing more people. You will be connecting with more people.
But anxieties are also expected.
Because I understand Australians, having been at home for several months, may be a bit cautious.
Because casting caution aside brings confidence and consumption, and with that, an estimated 250,000 jobs a month, pulling down the mountain of 1 million unemployed.
Success is not being able to stand up every day and say there's 3 cases or 12 cases or 18 cases. Not when you've got 1 million people out of work. That's not success.
This Federation three-step represents Scott Morrison's best effort to rouse the states and territories from COVID hibernation in the quickest possible time. The expectations are clear, but the timing rests with premiers and chief ministers from here. What pressure the Prime Minister can bring to bear is financial. He's reminding everyone that his $200 billion worth of rescue payments are finite. As one government figure puts it, the nature of the Federation is that the states have all the power and we just pick up the bills. Of course, in a crisis like this one, the bills are enormous. So the Commonwealth's negotiating power, considerable. Greg Jennett, ABC News, Canberra.
Well, let's take a look at how the states have responded. Daniel Andrews says he'll make an announcement about Victoria's plans on Monday, while the New South Wales Premier has confirmed no further changes in her state this week. Queensland says it will begin its step 1 next Saturday, while WA's Premier says he'll announce his state's roadmap on Sunday. And South Australia is planning to ease some restrictions on Monday. On Monday, Tasmania will ease restrictions on funerals, aged care visits and national parks, and gatherings of more than 10 people will be allowed in the ACT from midnight tonight, while the Northern Territory is already moving through its reopening plans announced last week. The roadmap out of COVID-19 has been built with input from nations across the world in the so-called First Movers Group. The collection of countries, which includes Australia, has been sharing data on how to lift restrictions safely. So what's being done overseas, and will it help get life back to normal sooner here in Australia? Casey Briggs explains.
There's a simple concept at the heart of all the complex disease modelling. The more people interact, the more likely it is the virus spreads. And the latest Doherty Institute analysis suggests adherence to social distancing in Australia is already starting to decay, even as most restrictions remain in place. But it's early days, and the researchers noted that the strongest signal of reduced adherence is for activities considered to be relatively low risk, like driving and visiting parks. Patients may be wearing thin. No two countries are the same, but Denmark's lockdowns bore some similarity to Australia's, with gatherings limited to 10 and bars, gyms and hairdressers closed. Denmark started to open up almost a month ago, and despite hairdressers being quickly booked out, the country's curve has plateaued. We're yet to see any signs of a second wave of new cases, although the virus is lingering around. Danes have been slow to return to public transport, as measured by users of Apple's Maps app, although driving activity is fast returning toward normal levels. It's a similar trend in the Czech Republic, as well as other countries that have started to move early, like Austria and also Israel. And they're all countries our government has been taking tips from. Of course, not every country easing off on physical distancing is in the same position. In the US, 30 states are now walking back stay-at-home orders. That doesn't include New York, the hardest hit state, where the death rate is no longer growing. But most of those other 30 states that are opening up, they're still climbing the curve. For the past week, the United States as a whole has been averaging almost 1,800 deaths a day.
So where does Australia stand among the First Movers Group? Toby Phillips is a research lead with the Oxford Coronavirus Government Response Tracker, and he joins me now. Now, Toby, we've just heard about countries there who have started to move early. How does Australia fit into this category?
Look, I'd say Australia is squarely in the first movers category. Looking globally, the report just then listed maybe 4 or 5 countries that have started to move, but that's about all there is. There's probably less than 10 countries that have actually started to ease off at the moment. And so when you look kind of globally at this cohort of around 200 countries in the world, Australia is definitely one of the first ones that are thinking about rolling back or stepping down those restrictions. I would say a lot of countries are in the same position of starting to talk about it and starting to announce it, but we're still very much at a point where few countries have actually acted on the rollbacks, and so Australia will be one of the first to start moving out of the lockdown.
And given some of these countries that we've heard about have had these restrictions lifted for a month already, a month ahead of us, and they haven't yet seen a sharp rise in cases, is this something we can learn from these countries?
Yeah, definitely. I think the lesson there is that it's a very gradual process. So in the research project that I'm working on and helping lead at Oxford, we're tracking the overall stringency and the strictness of government responses. And, what we saw almost universally around the world was that in mid-March, almost all countries went from very near 0 to very near 100. So you had this very rapid ramp up in the strictness of policy responses. On the other side, as we're seeing that strictness curve, if you like, roll back and come down, countries are taking it much more gradually. So, the sorts of restrictions in Denmark that are still in place, in Austria just 2 weeks ago, they started to ease back, but there's still bans on gatherings over 10 people. So And I think Australia seems to be taking these lessons to heart and is following a similar approach where on the way into lockdown, it's very strict, it's very hard, and on the way out, it's quite gradual, quite modular, making small changes and seeing what happens.
Well, our health minister says it's looking to South Korea, Japan and Singapore to inform our exit strategy. Which bits of their policies do you think we're looking at here?
So I think that's an interesting set of countries. Singapore at the moment hasn't really started to roll back in a meaningful way. But I think what we can learn from these countries, I will say South Korea has started to roll back about 2 weeks ago. What we can learn from these countries is also a bit about how they went into the lockdown. So I think these countries acted quite quickly with measures around testing, measures around contact tracing, and they also had very rapid responses just from the general public. People stopped going to restaurants, stopped going to large gatherings. They did that voluntarily. And so that meant that for these countries that kind of responded very quickly, we're talking like in early February, they didn't need to go quite as strict. So speed was a bit of the essence on the way in. And, you know, as we're exiting the lockdown, we can perhaps learn some lessons from how having a broad response, a response focused on testing and tracing and on the actual behaviour of individuals, that can mean that we don't need such harsh policy measures in place.
Well, the WHO actually outlines the measures that governments need to have in place before they even consider reducing the restrictions. You've been analysing this data. Have you found that countries have been complying?
Look, I think no country is perfectly in position according to the WHO's checklist. So the WHO outlined these kind of 6 criteria that countries should try to meet before they roll back. In the case of Australia, you know, the very first criteria is to have reduced transmission. And for the last few weeks, Australia was doing really well. But then, you know, in the last week, I think it was in Victoria, there was this recent outbreak at a factory. And so now if you look at the rates of transmission, it's actually climbing in Australia. So I think, you know, the situation changes in every country every day, and countries might meet some criteria one day and then change the next day. So it's a little bit about being adaptive and thinking on your feet and being able and ready to change. I think that these kind of levels of lockdown will help governments do that. I will say on the other measures that the WHO talks about, Australia is doing fairly well. So testing and tracing, there's a lot of testing going on. We've got pretty strong border closures. How long that can go for is another question, how long there's the appetite to keep the borders closed. But certainly the WHO says that countries should have plans in place to manage the risks of imported cases. And I think probably the most important one of the WHO criteria, but the one that's hardest to measure, is about whether communities are really starting to engage and respond to this new normal. Because at the end of the day, that's where transmission happens. And so it's about how people learn to adapt their lives to this new normal rather than just trying to go straight back to business as usual.
Well, let's talk about those border closures. How soon do you think things will return to normal globally and we'll be able to start travelling overseas again?
So globally, I think it will be quite a long time. I mean, there's sort of 2 parts to the travel. There's, you know, for an Australian, there's whether the Department of Foreign Affairs is willing to let people travel. I think at the moment there's a bit of a procedure to almost get permission to leave the country. You know, that's a question for the Australian government. Maybe that changes in the next few months. But the other side of it is whether other countries are going to let you come in. You know, when we look globally across our tracker of policy responses, most countries in the world right now have border closures. I was just checking up on a few of them this morning. France has said that their borders are likely to stay closed at least until October. So, you know, countries are really getting into this long-term thinking about how they're going to respond to the virus. They're putting in long-term policies. And I think it will be many months, probably into next year, and indeed certainly before we have a global situation that's back to anything close to normal. I think we can expect a lot of quarantines, a lot of screenings, and outright border closures coming on and off, depending on how individual countries are finding their caseload.
We'll check back with you perhaps in a year, Toby, and hopefully things will have changed. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Really appreciate it.